The district's proposed Student Safety and Behavioral Risk Assessment Initiative arrived in a glossy packet months before anyone on the receiving end had a chance to parse its implications. Framed as a data-driven solution to discipline inefficiencies and preventing disruptions, the policy relied on a third-party algorithm that ingested attendance, prior disciplinary records, grades, teacher referrals, even neighborhood crime statistics, and spit out risk scores, predicting which students were likely to escalate. Those flagged would be subject to increased monitoring, mandatory behavioral interventions, and in many cases, preemptive removal from standard classrooms, often without meaningful parental notification or appeal. Its rollout was to be fast-tracked with a pilot in 3 schools, justified by district leadership as modernizing safety, while slashing what they framed as escalating costs from reactive discipline. Tanya Mitchell saw it coming from the edges. Her son Malik, a quiet 5th grader with a diagnosed processing difference, had been caught in the net of subjective concern before. Teachers sometimes misread his anxiety as defiance, and the school's response had been more punitive than supportive. Tanya spent hours advocating, filling out accommodation forms, and translating educational jargon into action plans. When she first heard about the new initiative from a flyer slipped under the PTA door and a parent email thread buzzing with vague praise, something in her gut tightened. The language in the policy, predictive risk, behavioral deviation, proactive removal, sounded a lot like the code she'd seen in other systems turn difference into danger. She went online, downloaded the draft, and read it at night after putting Malik to bed. The algorithm's data inputs weren't transparent. There was no clear path for contesting a score. The vendor's white papers promised efficiency, while bearing disclaimers about training data drawn from years of disciplinary records that reflected the district's existing racial disparities. The more she read, the more she realized the policy would formalize what had nearly derailed Malik's confidence. A system that codified who was trouble before they even acted, funneling disproportionate surveillance and exclusion onto Black and neurodivergent kids. Tanya didn't have a seat on any official committee, but she had something the board didn't. Other parents quietly feeling the same tension, and a lived instinct about what happens when power defines behavior without accountability. She reached out to a few moms in the school parking lot, the after-school tutor who had seen how Malik shut down after being called disruptive, and Mrs. Green, the veteran librarian who'd quietly kept a list of students who'd been punished for asking too many questions. She began to talk to them not in the language of theory, but of consequence. If they label his quietness as risk, they'll take him out before he gets a chance to be heard. When the official community preview meeting was announced, 2 weeks before the board's vote, Tanya filled out the request to speak. She didn't know yet that what she was bringing would be dismissed not on content, but on tone. The policy's authors, their consultant liaisons, and a curated chorus of safety advocates showed up to sing the initiative's virtues. The first fissure had formed. Tanya only knew she had to go louder, smarter, and more organized than too emotional would allow her to be. At the preliminary forum, the school auditorium had been staged to ease anxiety. Soft lighting, a panel of smiling administrators, and a PowerPoint titled, "Protecting Our Children Together." Tanya arrived early with Malik in tow. He sat in the back drawing, the quiet anchor she had worked so hard to build around him. When the public comment section opened, she went to the microphone and began with a measured personal story about her son. The way his heart raced in crowded hallways, how a misplaced referral had nearly labeled him defiant, and how the new risk score would turn his learning difference into a self-fulfilling prophecy of exclusion. Mid-sentence, a district communications aide interrupted with a soft cough, a signal from the moderator. "Ma'am, we have a limited time. Please keep your remarks concise." Tanya finished, then turned to the next parent. After the presentations, the board's policy champion, a white deputy superintendent named Caroline Hayes, thanked everyone for their passionate input and moved on. A local board member, prepped with scripted talking points, leaned toward the microphone and said, "We heard some strong emotion tonight. I want to remind parents that this policy is based on data, not anxiety. Let's not let feelings cloud our judgment." The phrase too emotional slipped into conversations outside the meeting like a dropped stone. Tanya's concerns about algorithmic bias, lack of due process, and the psychological harms of preemptive labeling were reframed in the next PTA email as understandable parental worry, while the board's internal summary memo referred to her and a few others as particularly vocal stakeholders requiring calming. The effect was clear. She could be heard, but not legitimized. Her lived experience was reduced to mood rather than evidence. Instead of retreating, Tanya turned that dismissal into a strategy. She gathered the other parents who'd been there. They formed an informal coalition, Parents for Fair Schools, and began meeting in her living room after work. Mrs. Green introduced her to a high school student in the district, Ava, who tutored younger kids and was taking an introductory data science elective. Ava had already noticed the racial disparities in the discipline data on campus. She agreed to help pull what she could from publicly available datasets. A young special education teacher, Mark, quietly provided anonymized examples of students who would be flagged under the proposed scoring system and described what those labels had done to their sense of self-worth in other districts where similar tools had been used. Tanya also filed a formal request under the state's public records law for the algorithm's training data, performance audits, and the contract between the district and the vendor. She learned quickly that the vendor had inserted non-disclosure clauses and that the district had accepted proprietary secrecy over transparency, a red flag she began to write about in emails to sympathetic local education reporters. Being called too emotional became a badge of visibility. She trained herself to shape that energy into sharp, evidence-backed questions and to coach other parents to do the same. The deeper the coalition dug, the uglier the architecture of the policy looked. Ava scraped archived discipline data from previous years and, with the help of an ethics-minded computer science professor at the nearby university, built a simple model demonstrating how historical bias would bake into future predictions. Black students were already more likely to receive referrals for ambiguous behaviors. Feeding those referrals into the predictive algorithm amplified their weight, making them more likely to be flagged, which in turn created more disciplinary action, a feedback loop dressed as risk mitigation. Mark brought forward stories. A Latino boy with English as a second language once punished for non-compliance because he misunderstood a directive. A girl with sensory processing issues labeled aggressive after she covered her ears in a noisy cafeteria. And a gifted black student whose brilliant tangents were coded as off-task pattern deviations. Those stories, when combined with the quantitative pieces Ava and the professor produced, formed a pattern risk would not be neutral. Tanya obtained the vendor contract. It revealed that the company had a clause. The district would receive performance bonuses tied to reductions in visible disciplinary incidents, not behavioral improvement, metrics that incentivized exclusion rather than support. The same vendor had been involved in a similar rollout in a neighboring state that, after public backlash, was revised only after a black teenager's suspension led to a wrongful expulsion lawsuit. That case file, which Tanya found through open court records, became an external mirror showing what could happen if unchecked. She also discovered that one of the board members promoting the initiative had a prior consulting connection, indirectly benefiting from the district's investment in the vendor through a civic advisory board that receives stipends for innovation consulting. Armed with data, testimony, and a narrative about conflicting interests, Tanya and the coalition built a presentation. They didn't just show harm. They offered alternatives, targeted restorative interventions, transparent multi-factor reviews with parental consent, and pilot programs to invest in counselors rather than surveillance. They also recruited students who would have been flagged, teenagers who could speak about how their peers internalized labels, and a black high school junior who'd been quietly organizing mindfulness groups after seeing classmates withdraw when risk scores were verbally mentioned in staff meetings. To broaden the coalition beyond race and disability, Tanya brought in a suburban parent whose child had been misidentified as a risk due to anxiety, and a retired white teacher who had seen similar punitive systems in other districts fail. They co-signed op-eds and created a simple, shareable one-pager titled How Risk Becomes Reality, A Parent's Guide to the Proposed Policy. The night of the formal vote, The boardroom was filled beyond capacity. Local media had set up cameras after Tanya's pre-release op-ed circulated on a regional education blog. District officials had arranged a polished town hall version of the meeting, with stacked testimonials from security experts and administrators describing how the algorithm would remove subjective inconsistencies and catch problems before they balloon. Board members wearing pins that read, "Safe schools, strong futures," spoke in rehearsed cadence about community responsibility. Tanya was third in the public comment order. Before she stepped to the microphone, a board aide approached with a tight smile. "We ask that comments stay succinct and refrain from inflammatory language," he muttered. "We'd hate for your passion to be construed as something that undermines constructive dialogue." She nodded, the old label glinting in the subtext. She began not with data, but with Malik's morning routine. She described how he checked the hallway for sounds before stepping out, because he'd internalized that difference drew attention. How he had been told by a teacher in middle school that kids like you are the ones these tools are built to watch, and how a predictive label would carry weight without anyone ever asking what he needed to thrive. The board chair's pen hovered. She then pivoted calmly. "If you want a policy built on facts, here are the facts," and laid out the model Ava and the professor had developed, the incentive misalignment in the contract, and the case history from the neighboring district. When she finished, the room murmured, not because she had been emotional, but because she had shifted the frame. The emotional hook made the facts land with people who'd tuned out jargon. One of the junior board members, a younger white woman who had previously voted with the majority, leaned forward and asked a pointed question about due process for students flagged. Tanya didn't let the board's earlier attempts at control define her. She answered with clear policy alternatives and called out the conflict of interest. "We are being asked to trust a system where the same people designing risk reduction profit when visible incidents decrease, not when students heal." The lead proponent, Caroline Hayes, attempted to reframe. "Ms. Mitchell, your testimony is compelling, but some of the language you used inflames rather than informs. We have to balance safety with process." A conservative board member followed with, "Isn't this just a fear of being watched? If everyone complies, there's nothing to worry about." Tanya looked at them. The problem isn't the watching. It's who decides what's dangerous based on their assumptions, and then locks it into code. The turning point came when a high school junior, a black girl who'd been part of Tanya's coalition, stepped up and spoke about her little brother being terrified because a counselor had shown him the prototype risk card and told him to behave or the system will flag you. Her voice wavered, then steadied. "You said you were protecting me," she told the board, "but you were scaring me before I even did anything wrong." The live stream that captured her closed with the board's polite silence, momentary but palpable. The board's scheduled vote seemed poised in inertia. The proposal had built internal momentum, and staff reports recommended adoption with a phased implementation. But the coalition had introduced something the policy architects hadn't accounted for: public accountability and the threat of reputational cost. Local faith leaders, previously quiet, showed up with letters. The city's teacher union released a statement backing more transparent, restorative alternatives. The education reporter Tanya had quietly fed with documents published a follow-up piece, highlighting the vendor's incentive structure and the board members' indirect ties to the consulting network, framing it as a governance question, not a conspiracy theory. Behind the scenes, a faction of board members began to fracture. The junior white member who'd asked Tanya to clarify the due process question requested a closed caucus, expressing concern that the district's equity review had been bypassed and that legal liability for discriminatory outcomes had not been fully considered. The board chair, sensing the shift, tried to move to a watered-down amendment, keeping the algorithm but adding parental notifications and opt-out language that was easy to file away and ignore in practice. Tanya stood to object. "That's a bandage on a wound you're still causing," she said. Then, an unexpected ally surfaced. The district's own data analyst, a quiet mid-level staffer who had seen the model's sensitivity analysis and privately shared with Tanya that the false positive rate for black students was 3 times that of white students. Yet the official brief to the board had sanitized that, citing limitations. He stepped to the microphone, uncomfortable but firm, and corroborated the coalition's technical claims. The room shifted. The crescendo arrived when one of the original safety expert witnesses, a retired white administrator from a neighboring district, publicly recanted his earlier uncritical support. He'd visited the coalition's grassroots market and seen firsthand how the system he'd helped launch in his own district had marginalized families. "We were told we were modernizing," he said, "but we were weaponizing suspicion. I don't want the city to repeat what I regret." Under pressure, the board table did the unexpected. They voted to pause the rollout, establish an independent review with community representation, and strip the vendor contract of its incentive clause pending an equity audit. The dangerous policy was not dead, but it was cracked open, its momentum stopped, and its authors exposed to scrutiny they hadn't prepared for. The pause created a space the coalition leveraged. Tanya was invited, reluctantly at first, into the Review and Equity Working Group that the board established as a face-saving mechanism. She insisted the group's charter include explicit representation from parents of marginalized students, data transparency mandates, an independent technical audit panel including the university professor, and a public dashboard for flagged cases. The board's earlier smears about her emotion quietly transformed into a grudging acknowledgement from some members that community voices had filled a gap their own internal processes missed. The independent audit confirmed what Tanya had warned. The underlying risk model amplified existing disparities, and without structural change, the policy would have disproportionately funneled Black, disabled, and low-income students into punitive tracks. The board, under mounting public attention, agreed to shelve the algorithmic scoring altogether and instead co-develop a new initiative, a restorative support framework that used human-centered early warning flags, required transparent multi-stakeholder reviews before any exclusion, and invested in additional counselors, culturally responsive training for staff, and peer mediation programs. The vendor contract was renegotiated. The district retained only the parts of the data infrastructure that could be adapted for supportive uses, with open-source code and public oversight. Caroline Hayes issued a careful public statement that included a nod, worded in bureaucratic phrasing, to listening and evolving based on community input. Tanya didn't accept a public apology as a conclusion. She demanded a structural commitment, the creation of a permanent parent and equity oversight council, with that same representation they'd previously tried to limit to advisory. Her name was added as a founding member, not as a token, but with real voting power on any future policies involving predictive analytics, discipline, or student risk identification. Malik, who had sat through that first meeting sullen and scared, watched his mother transform her pain into policy. The school held a small recognition ceremony, not a trophy, but a plaque in the community learning center that read, "In honor of parents who refused to be silenced. Your vigilance changed our trajectory." The dangerous policies language became case material in district training. The phrase "too emotional" was rewritten into a discussion module titled Emotion as Insight, when lived experience signals systemic risk. A year later, the district's disciplinary rates had shifted. Not because discipline disappeared, but because the conversation around it had deepened. What would have been an opaque scoring tool became a participatory early warning system where educators, parents, and students jointly reviewed patterns before any action, and restorative circles intervened before exclusion. Tanya Mitchell's face appeared in training videos, with her permission, as an example of parent leadership, and she was invited to speak to neighboring districts about building trust-based governance. She founded the Equitable Schools Network, a grassroots coalition connecting parents across zip codes to share knowledge, coach one another on public comment, and audit local policies. Ava, the high school data student, went on to major in civic data science and now helps school districts build transparent dashboards that surface disparities before they calcify. Malik, now more confident, became a peer mentor to younger kids, telling them that the same voice that was once called too emotional had stopped something that could have cost their futures. The board's culture had new guardrails. Newly proposed technical systems required pre-deployment community impact assessments. A parent fellow slot was created for rotating families to shadow policymakers. Tanya's role evolved from watchdog to mentor. She still attended hearings, still asked sharp questions, but now she also trained younger parents how to parse contracts, file equity complaints, and translate their stories into policy leverage, teaching them to own their emotion as evidence, not weakness. The dangerous policy that almost institutionalized biased surveillance became a footnote in a larger narrative, a pivot point at which a system could have shut a parent down and instead opened because she refused to shrink. In the quiet of her kitchen, months later, Tanya taped a small card above Malik's homework nook. Speak. They will try to label you. Make your words true anyway. The story wasn't over. Other policies would test the new norms. But the precedent was clear. When the people the system was built to serve push back with truth and organization, they can stop harm before it becomes permanent.